Japan planned to drop plague-infected fleas on U.S. cities in 1945, a bioweapon that could have killed millions. August 1945, Pingfang, Manchuria. Inside the concrete walls of Unit 731, General Shiro Ishii watches thousands of fleas crawl across laboratory trays, each one carrying deadly plague bacteria. His plan is chilling. Load these tiny killers onto submarines, sail across the Pacific, and rain biological death over San Diego and Los Angeles. American families would die in their homes, plague spreading through neighborhoods like wildfire. But something stopped this nightmare from becoming reality. While Japanese scientists bred death in secret labs, American factories pumped out medical supplies at impossible speeds, 650,000 tons of vaccines, antibiotics, and equipment. Two nations raced toward a collision that never came. One side prepared plague, the other prepared medicine. The question that haunts history: what if those submarines had actually launched? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The humid air of Pingfang, Manchuria carried the stench of death and disinfectant. General Shiro Ishii adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and stepped into Laboratory Building 7, where rows of metal cages lined concrete walls. Inside each cage, Chinese prisoners huddled against the cold, unaware they were about to become test subjects for the most horrific bioweapon ever conceived. Ishii's plan was elegantly simple and utterly terrifying. Breed plague-infected fleas, load them onto submarines, and drop them over American cities. The laboratory equipment told its own story of scientific horror. Glass incubators maintained precise temperatures for breeding Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused bubonic plague. Microscopes magnified the tiny killers as they multiplied in petri dishes. Refrigeration units kept specimens viable for weeks. Each piece of equipment served one purpose: turning nature's deadliest disease into a weapon of mass destruction. Ishii watched technicians transfer fleas from breeding chambers to transport containers. These weren't ordinary fleas. They were biological missiles, each one capable of infecting dozens of victims. The general calculated payload requirements: 10 kilograms of infected fleas could theoretically devastate a city the size of San Diego. His engineers had designed ceramic bombs that would shatter on impact, releasing clouds of plague-carrying insects over residential neighborhoods. The I-400 submarines represented Japan's last desperate gamble. These massive vessels could travel 3,700 kilometers without refueling, just enough to reach the American West Coast and return. Only two existed, and both would be needed for Operation Black Rain. Ishii traced submarine routes on wall maps, marking attack coordinates over Los Angeles and San Diego. The journey would take 3 weeks each way, during which the fleas had to remain alive and infectious. Technical challenges mounted daily. Fleas required constant feeding, but food was scarce in wartime Japan. Temperature fluctuations killed entire batches. Maintaining plague virulence over long ocean voyages seemed nearly impossible. Yet Ishii persisted, driven by the belief that biological terror could force American surrender where conventional weapons had failed. Across the Pacific Ocean, a different kind of preparation was underway. Dr. Joseph Victor stood in the medical storage facility at Fort Detrick, Maryland, surveying an empire of healing. Wooden crates stretched from floor to ceiling, each containing thousands of vaccine doses. Refrigerated units hummed constantly, preserving typhoid vaccines, smallpox inoculants, and experimental plague antibodies. The contrast with Japan's struggling bioweapon program was staggering. Fort Detrick's medical supplies represented American industrial might at its peak. Production lines churned out 50,000 vaccine doses daily. Penicillin flowed from pharmaceutical plants in quantities that dwarfed global production just years earlier. Sterile syringes arrived by the millions, manufactured in factories that operated around the clock. Every element of the medical supply chain demonstrated America's overwhelming capacity to protect its forces. Victor checked inventory sheets with methodical precision. The numbers told an incredible story: 650,000 tons of medical supplies produced in 1945 alone. enough vaccines to inoculate every American soldier multiple times, sufficient antibiotics to treat a plague outbreak affecting millions. The industrial democracy that built this medical fortress could outproduce any biological threat Japan might devise. Nurses and medics prepared shipments for overseas deployment. Crates of vaccines bound for Pacific battlefields moved through loading docks with assembly line efficiency. Each shipment contained enough medical supplies to equip an entire division. Transportation networks moved these life-saving materials across oceans with the same precision that delivered bombs and bullets to the front lines. The Fort Detrick facility embodied America's unique advantage, the marriage of scientific knowledge and industrial capacity. While Japanese scientists struggled to keep fleas alive in laboratory cages, American factories pumped out medical countermeasures at impossible scales. Mass production techniques perfected for automobiles and aircraft now served medicine, creating abundance where enemies faced scarcity. Victor watched trucks depart for East Coast ports, their cargo holds filled with vaccines and antibiotics. These vehicles represented more than medical supplies. They carried the industrial strength of a free society mobilized for war. The same democratic principles that built America's factories now protected its citizens from biological warfare, creating a shield of medicine and mass production that no enemy could penetrate. Mary Johnson pinned her nurse's cap and surveyed the emergency medical station in downtown San Diego. Blood plasma storage units lined the basement of Mercy Hospital, each container representing potential salvation for wounded Marines returning from Pacific battles. The city's 500,000 residents had no idea how close they came to becoming targets of biological warfare, but Johnson and her colleagues prepared for every contingency. San Diego's civil defense materials revealed a community mobilized for total war. Gas masks hung in school classrooms. Air raid sirens dotted neighborhood rooftops. Blackout curtains covered every window, ready to plunge the city into darkness at the first sign of enemy aircraft. Emergency medical kits stocked with antibiotics and burn treatments filled storage rooms throughout the city. Johnson checked blood plasma reserves with the thoroughness of a military quartermaster. 5,000 units of typoplasma sat ready for mass casualty events. Enough medical supplies to treat twice the expected casualties from any air raid. The city had learned from Pearl Harbor. Preparation meant survival. Civil defense drills occurred weekly, turning ordinary citizens into emergency responders. Teachers learned to recognize chemical weapon symptoms. Factory workers practiced evacuation procedures. Housewives stockpiled medical supplies and canned goods. Each drill reinforced the community's determination to survive whatever enemies might unleash. The basement storage facility contained more than medical supplies. It held the community's collective will to resist. Bandages, antiseptics, and emergency rations represented civilian contribution to the war effort. Volunteers donated blood, rolled bandages, and prepared emergency shelters. Democracy's strength lay not just in factories and armies, but in citizens willing to sacrifice for the common defense. Children practiced evacuation drills with the seriousness of soldiers preparing for battle. They filed into school basements, clutching small gas masks designed for young faces. Teachers maintained calm while preparing for horrors they hoped would never come. These drills built psychological resilience alongside physical preparedness, creating a population ready to endure and overcome. Johnson watched a group of school children exit Mercy Hospital after touring the blood bank. Their faces mixed curiosity with determination, the next generation learning that freedom required vigilance. These children would grow up in a world where biological weapons existed, but also where democratic societies possessed the industrial strength to defend against them. The balance between terror and protection would define their lives, just as it defined the war their parents fought to win. Inside Unit 731's breeding facility, technicians faced an impossible challenge, keeping thousands of plague-infected fleas alive under wartime conditions. The flea breeding chambers represented the pinnacle of biological weapon engineering, yet they revealed the fundamental weakness of Japan's entire bioweapons program. Each ceramic container held hundreds of fleas, but maintaining their health required resources Japan simply didn't possess. The breeding chambers themselves were marvels of improvised engineering. Clay vessels maintained humidity levels essential for flea survival. Primitive heating systems struggled to provide consistent temperatures. Feeding schedules required precise timing. Too little food and the fleas died. Too much and plague virulence decreased. Every variable had to be perfect, yet perfection was impossible under siege conditions. Ishii's scientists documented their failures with scientific precision. Batch after batch of fleas died from malnutrition, temperature fluctuations, or bacterial contamination. The plague bacteria itself proved unstable outside laboratory conditions. Refrigeration systems failed regularly, destroying weeks of careful cultivation. Each setback pushed Operation Black Rain further from reality. The mathematical challenges were overwhelming. 10 kilograms of infected fleas required breeding millions of insects under perfect conditions. Japan's entire bioweapons program possessed fewer than 50 breeding chambers, each producing only small quantities of viable specimens. Scale up to military effectiveness seemed impossible given wartime shortages of food, fuel, and materials. Ceramic bomb designs sat on laboratory tables, awaiting payloads that might never materialize. These weapons would shatter on impact, releasing flea clouds over American cities. Engineers calculated dispersal patterns and infection rates with mathematical precision, but their calculations assumed unlimited supplies of healthy, plague-infected fleas. Reality fell far short of requirements. Laboratory technicians worked 18-hour shifts, desperately trying to meet Ishii's impossible deadlines. They fed fleas with rice flour mixed with blood, both increasingly scarce commodities. Heating fuel was rationed, forcing them to choose between maintaining breeding temperatures and keeping laboratory equipment operational. Every decision involved trade-offs that undermined the program's effectiveness. The breeding chambers that should have produced biological terror instead demonstrated the limits of totalitarian science. Without abundant resources, precise manufacturing, and redundant systems, biological weapons remained laboratory curiosities. Japan's scientists possessed the knowledge to create plague weapons, but lacked the industrial infrastructure to deploy them effectively. The fleas that survived represented more potential than actual threat, symbols of what might have been rather than instruments of war. Boeing's Seattle plant thundered with the sound of American industrial might. B-29 production lines stretched across factory floors the size of city blocks, each assembly station contributing to an aircraft that would dominate Pacific skies. The production line components told a story of manufacturing supremacy that dwarfed anything Japan could achieve. One bomber rolled off the line every 4 hours, each carrying 20 tons of destruction across thousands of miles. The contrast between American abundance and Japanese scarcity was visible in every rivet and wire. While Japanese scientists struggled to keep fleas alive in laboratory cages, American factories produced 650 B-29 bombers in 1945 alone. Each aircraft required 55,000 individual parts manufactured with precision across dozens of states. The logistics of coordinating this production made Japan's bioweapon program look primitive by comparison. Factory workers moved with choreographed efficiency, installing engines, electronics, and weaponry systems. The same mass production techniques that revolutionized automobile manufacturing now created instruments of air power. Assembly line speed meant American forces gained air superiority. Through sheer numbers, more planes than enemy forces could possibly counter. Boeing engineers calculated payload capacities that revealed America's overwhelming advantage. A single B-29 could deliver more destructive force than Japan's entire bioweapon stockpile. 20 tons of conventional bombs per aircraft multiplied by 650 aircraft equaled 13,000 tons of ordnance delivered anywhere in the Pacific. Ishii's few kilograms of infected fleas paled before such devastating arithmetic. The production statistics seemed impossible, yet they reflected democratic capitalism's unique strengths. Private companies competing for military contracts drove innovation and efficiency. Worker productivity soared when free people fought for their own survival. Management and labor cooperated to achieve production goals that totalitarian systems couldn't match despite coercion and propaganda. Raw materials flowed into Boeing plants from across America, aluminum from Tennessee, steel from Pennsylvania, electronics from California. This industrial network represented decades of investment in education, infrastructure, and technology. Japan's isolated, resource-poor islands could never support comparable manufacturing capacity, regardless of scientific knowledge or military determination. Each completed B-29 represented more than air power. It embodied America's systematic approach to warfare. While enemies relied on desperate improvisation and secret weapons, democratic societies applied industrial methods to military problems. Mass production, quality control, and continuous improvement created sustainable advantages that individual genius or fanatical determination couldn't overcome. The bombers leaving Seattle would end the war through sheer overwhelming force, making biological weapons irrelevant before they could be deployed. In a cramped bunker beneath Tokyo, Japanese naval officers gathered around charts that told a story of impossible odds. The Japanese naval planning documents spread across the table revealed Operation Black Rain in stark mathematical terms. 2 I-400 submarines, 3,500-kilometer range limitations, and payload capacities measured in mere kilograms. Admiral Yamamoto's successors faced the same problem that had doomed their fleet at Midway, insufficient resources to achieve. Strategic objectives. The I-400 submarines represented Japan's most advanced technology, yet even they revealed the nation's industrial limitations. Only 2 vessels existed capable of reaching American shores. Each submarine could carry approximately 10 tons of payload, but biological weapons required specialized storage that reduced effective capacity to mere kilograms. The numbers didn't support Ishii's ambitious plans for widespread biological attack. Fuel calculations dominated planning discussions. The round trip to California would consume nearly all available submarine fuel, leaving no margin for combat operations or evasive maneuvers. American destroyer patrols had intensified along shipping routes, making detection increasingly likely. The submarines would have to navigate 18,000 kilometers of hostile waters with no possibility of refueling or resupply. Naval planners examined intelligence reports describing American coastal defenses. Radar installations tracked aircraft movements hundreds of kilometers offshore. Submarine detection equipment had improved dramatically since Pearl Harbor. Shore batteries commanded every major harbor approach. The Americans had learned from surprise attack. Penetrating their defenses would require resources Japan no longer possessed. The planning documents revealed a deeper problem: strategic confusion born of desperation. Operation Black Rain represented biological warfare, yet Japan's naval leadership understood conventional military power. Coordinating between Ishii's biological weapons program and submarine operations required expertise that didn't exist within Japanese command structures. Scientists and sailors spoke different languages, literally and figuratively. Time pressure intensified every decision. American bombers were destroying Japanese cities monthly. Industrial capacity collapsed under sustained bombardment. The window for any submarine operation was closing rapidly as fuel shortages grounded the remaining fleet. Operation Black Rain had to launch soon or never. But launching meant almost certain destruction of Japan's last long-range submarines. The naval officers folded their charts with grim resignation. Mathematics trumped courage, logistics defeated determination. 2 submarines carrying biological weapons couldn't achieve what the combined fleet had failed to accomplish with hundreds of vessels and thousands of aircraft. The planning documents that should have enabled biological terror instead documented the impossibility of challenging American industrial supremacy. Operation Black Rain died in a Tokyo bunker, victim of arithmetic as much as enemy action. The War Production Board's Chicago headquarters buzzed with activity that made Japanese planners despair. American industrial statistics covered office walls like battle maps, production charts showing impossible numbers that redefined warfare itself. In 1945, American factories produced 2.5 million tons of military supplies monthly, a figure that exceeded Japan's entire wartime output. The numbers represented more than manufacturing capacity. They embodied democracy's decisive advantage over totalitarian systems. Statistical analysts tracked production with scientific precision. Aircraft factories delivered 5,000 planes monthly. Shipyards launched 2 Liberty ships daily. Ammunition plants produced enough artillery shells to supply every gun in the world. Each statistic reinforced the same conclusion. American abundance had overwhelmed enemy scarcity through sheer industrial momentum. The production miracle extended beyond weapons to medical supplies that made biological warfare ineffective. Pharmaceutical companies manufactured penicillin doses numbering in the millions. Vaccine production exceeded global disease threats by orders of magnitude. Medical equipment rolled off assembly lines faster than armies could deploy it. Japan's bioweapon program seemed primitive against such overwhelming medical preparedness. Coordination between government and industry achieved results impossible under command economies. Private companies competed for efficiency while cooperating on strategic goals. Worker productivity soared when employees understood they were fighting for their own freedom. Management innovations spread rapidly through voluntary networks rather than bureaucratic hierarchies. The Chicago facility coordinated production across 48 states, each contributing specialized capabilities to the war effort. Michigan built tanks and aircraft engines. California produced electronics and precision instruments. Texas refined oil into aviation fuel. Pennsylvania forged steel for ship construction. Geographic diversity created resilience that enemy bombing couldn't destroy. Raw material statistics revealed America's unique global position. Domestic oil production supplied Allied forces worldwide. Agricultural output fed armies on multiple continents. Mineral extraction provided aluminum, copper, and rare metals, essential for advanced weapons. Natural resource abundance, combined with industrial capacity, created sustainable military advantage that smaller nations couldn't match. Labor statistics told the war's human story. 12 million Americans worked in defense plants, including 6 million women who had entered the workforce for the first time. Their productivity exceeded pre-war levels despite shorter training periods. Democratic societies could mobilize human resources more effectively than dictatorships because free people worked harder when fighting for their own values. The Chicago Command Center represented capitalism's transformation into an instrument of victory. Profit motives aligned with patriotic duty, creating efficiency that pure ideology couldn't achieve. Competition drove innovation, while cooperation ensured strategic coordination. The industrial statistics covering office walls documented democracy's triumph over totalitarianism through superior organization of human and material resources. Dr. Sarah Mitchell examined blood plasma storage, units in the basement of Walter Reed Army Medical Center, each container representing America's systematic approach to biological defense. The plasma storage facility contained enough medical supplies to treat casualties from every biological weapon Japan might deploy. While enemy scientists bred death in secret laboratories, American medical personnel prepared healing on an industrial scale. The blood plasma program demonstrated democratic society's unique strengths. Voluntary donations from millions of Americans filled storage banks across the country. Citizens lined up at Red Cross stations, donating blood for soldiers they would never meet. This voluntary cooperation achieved results that coercion couldn't match: unlimited supplies of life-saving plasma available wherever needed. Mitchell calculated treatment capacities with military precision. 50,000 units of plasma stored in Washington alone. Similar facilities in every major city created redundant medical networks impossible to destroy. Even if biological weapons succeeded in contaminating one region, medical supplies from other areas could respond immediately. Geographic distribution of medical resources meant biological warfare couldn't achieve strategic objectives. Antibiotic production statistics revealed American pharmaceutical superiority. Penicillin manufacturing exceeded global disease threats by factors of thousands. Streptomycin production could treat every case of plague in human history. Sulfa drugs flowed from chemical plants in quantities that made biological warfare medically irrelevant. Japanese bioweapons would encounter medical countermeasures deployed at unprecedented scales. The plasma storage units embodied medical logistics that Japanese planners couldn't comprehend. Refrigeration networks maintained blood products across continental distances. Transportation systems moved medical supplies faster than diseases could spread. Communication networks coordinated medical responses across multiple time zones. The infrastructure that supported medical defense exceeded anything required for biological. Attack research laboratories adjoining the storage facility worked on medical countermeasures for every known biological weapon. Scientists studied plague bacteria, developing improved vaccines and treatments. Medical intelligence analyzed enemy biological programs, preparing specific responses for anticipated threats. While Japanese scientists tried to weaponize disease, American researchers strengthened defenses against those same diseases. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Mitchell supervised plasma testing procedures that guaranteed quality control impossible under wartime conditions in enemy countries. Each unit underwent multiple tests for contamination, blood type compatibility, and storage stability. Rejection rates remained low because abundant supplies meant high standards. Quality control at this level made American medical responses reliable. Where enemy biological weapons remained experimental, the blood plasma storage facility represented more than medical. Preparation, it symbolized democratic values translated into practical defense. Voluntary cooperation, scientific research, industrial production, and geographic coordination combined to create medical systems that could absorb and defeat any biological attack. The units of plasma surrounding Mitchell contained the antibodies of free people, their willingness to sacrifice for strangers, and their society's determination to heal rather than harm. Colonel James Harrison spread intelligence reports across his desk at the Pentagon, each document revealing the impossibility of Japanese biological warfare against American preparedness. The intelligence reports painted a clear picture. Ishi's bioweapon program possessed the knowledge to create terror weapons, but lacked the resources to deploy them effectively. American industrial capacity had created medical defenses that biological attack couldn't penetrate. Intercepted communications revealed the scope of Japan's biological ambitions. Unit 731 experiments on Chinese prisoners had produced viable plague bacteria. Scientists had developed ceramic bombs designed to spread infected fleas over populated areas. I-400 submarines could theoretically reach American shores carrying biological payloads. The scientific foundation for biological warfare existed within Japanese capabilities. However, intelligence analysis revealed fatal weaknesses in enemy planning. Japan possessed only 2 submarines capable of trans-Pacific missions. Fuel shortages limited operational ranges. Biological weapon storage required specialized equipment that didn't exist aboard submarines. Most critically, the quantities of viable biological agents fell far short of strategic requirements for attacking large population centers. American medical intelligence provided devastating assessments of biological weapon effectiveness against prepared populations. Plague outbreaks required specific conditions, overcrowding, poor sanitation, limited medical care that didn't exist in American cities. Antibiotic supplies exceeded any conceivable biological attack by orders of magnitude. Vaccine stockpiles could immunize entire metropolitan populations within days. The intelligence reports documented systematic American advantages that made biological warfare strategically pointless. Medical surveillance systems could detect disease outbreaks immediately. Emergency response networks could deploy countermeasures faster than epidemics could spread. Hospital capacity exceeded peacetime requirements by factors that anticipated wartime casualties. Public health infrastructure had been strengthened specifically to counter biological threats. Industrial intelligence revealed the mathematical impossibility of Japanese biological success. American pharmaceutical production exceeded Japanese bioweapon capacity by ratios of thousands to 1. Medical supply transportation networks moved healing faster than enemy submarines could deliver death. The same industrial systems that built aircraft and ships now produced medical defenses at scales that dwarfed any possible biological attack. Harrison studied photographs of Japanese biological facilities alongside American medical installations. The contrast was stark: primitive laboratory equipment versus industrial-scale pharmaceutical production, experimental biological weapons versus proven medical countermeasures, desperate improvisation versus systematic preparation. Japanese scientists had created biological weapons, but American society had created biological immunity. The intelligence reports contained a final, crucial assessment. Biological warfare represented Japan's admission of conventional military defeat. Nations resorting to biological weapons acknowledged their inability to achieve victory through normal military means. The reports documenting Japanese biological ambitions actually revealed American success in conventional warfare that made desperate measures irrelevant. General Curtis LeMay reviewed strategic assessment documents that quantified American victory in terms that left no room for doubt. The mathematical reality of war had crystallized into statistics that revealed biological weapons as irrelevant gestures against overwhelming conventional superiority. Japanese bioweapon capabilities, measured in kilograms, seemed pathetic against American military production, measured in millions of tons. Strategic assessments compared biological and conventional weapon effectiveness with scientific precision. Ishi's plague fleas might theoretically kill thousands, but B-29 bombers were actually killing thousands daily. Biological weapons required weeks to achieve effects that conventional bombing accomplished in hours. The time differential made biological warfare strategically worthless against enemies capable of immediate, massive retaliation. Intelligence estimates placed Japanese biological weapon stockpiles at fewer than 50 kilograms of viable agents. American bomber operations dropped 20,000 tons of ordnance monthly on Japanese targets. The ratio, 20,000 tons versus 50 kilograms, illustrated the complete irrelevance of biological warfare against conventional military supremacy. Numbers this stark left no room for strategic ambiguity. The assessment documents revealed broader patterns that explained American victory. Democratic societies had mobilized human and material resources more effectively than totalitarian systems. Free people worked harder and more efficiently when fighting for their own values. Industrial competition drove innovation faster than central planning. Geographic advantages combined with political systems to create sustainable military superiority. LeMay studied casualty projections that demonstrated biological warfare's limited impact even under optimal conditions. Plague outbreaks in modern American cities would affect thousands, not millions. Medical countermeasures would limit casualties to fractions of projections. Meanwhile, conventional bombing was destroying Japanese cities completely, making biological weapons seem like desperate improvisation rather than strategic innovation. Production statistics documented America's ability to sustain military operations indefinitely. Aircraft losses could be replaced faster than they occurred. Ammunition expenditure exceeded manufacturing capacity only briefly before production adjustments. Personnel casualties remained within sustainable limits given training pipeline capacity. American society had organized itself for total war more effectively than enemies assumed possible. The strategic assessment concluded with mathematical finality. Japan had lost the war when attacking American industrial capacity rather than avoiding it. Biological weapons represented acknowledgement of conventional defeat, not pathway to victory. The documents surrounding LeMay contained numbers that told war's outcome with scientific certainty. Overwhelming industrial advantage had made military victory inevitable. Regardless of enemy innovations or desperate measures, strategic planning shifted from defeating biological weapons to managing post-war occupation. Japanese bioweapon capabilities would be studied, scientists interrogated, and research data secured for American biological defense programs. The threat that never materialized would become intelligence that strengthened future American preparedness against biological warfare. The atomic flash over Hiroshima illuminated more than one city's destruction. It revealed the complete irrelevance of biological warfare against nations possessing ultimate weapons. Atomic bomb components scattered around Los Alamos represented scientific achievement that made every other weapon obsolete, including the biological agents gathering dust in Unit 731 laboratories. Nuclear warfare had rendered biological warfare strategically pointless before it could be attempted. Dr. Roberts. Oppenheimer examined plutonium processing equipment that had transformed theoretical physics into military reality. The Manhattan Project had achieved in 3 years what Japanese bioweapon programs couldn't accomplish in a decade, weapons capable of ending wars immediately. Little Boy and Fat Man contained more destructive power than every biological agent ever produced, deliverable in minutes rather than weeks. The atomic bomb components told a story of American scientific and industrial supremacy. Uranium enrichment required industrial facilities covering square miles. Plutonium production demanded nuclear reactors built from scratch. Precision engineering created implosion mechanisms more complex than anything in previous human history. The resources devoted to atomic weapons exceeded Japan's entire military budget. Nuclear weapon effectiveness made biological warfare seem primitive by comparison. Atomic bombs killed instantly across kilometers, while biological weapons required days or weeks to achieve effects measured in city blocks. Radiation prevented enemy occupation of targeted areas, while biological contamination could be treated with existing medical countermeasures. Nuclear warfare achieved strategic objectives that biological weapons couldn't approach. The Fat Man plutonium core sitting in its beryllium reflector represented more military power than every bioweapon in Japanese arsenals combined. 21 kilotons of explosive force deliverable by single aircraft, achieving destruction that biological warfare couldn't match with entire submarine fleets. The mathematical comparison was stark. Nuclear weapons had made every previous military technology obsolete. American atomic capabilities revealed the industrial democracy's ultimate advantage, the ability to mobilize scientific talent and industrial resources for breakthrough technologies. The Manhattan Project employed 130,000 workers across multiple states, coordinating research and production at scales impossible under authoritarian systems. Free societies could achieve scientific miracles that totalitarian systems couldn't imagine. Japanese surrender followed atomic bombing within days, proving nuclear warfare's decisive strategic impact. Biological weapons required weeks to achieve uncertain effects, while atomic weapons ended conflicts immediately through sheer terror and destruction. Ishii's fleas became irrelevant artifacts as mushroom clouds rose over Japanese cities. The atomic bomb components represented more than scientific achievement. They embodied democratic society's ability to create new realities faster than enemies could adapt. Nuclear weapons had compressed wartime decision-making from months to minutes, making biological warfare's slow effects strategically worthless. America had achieved military supremacy through industrial science that made every enemy innovation obsolete before deployment. The post-war medical infrastructure emerging across America transformed wartime biological defenses into peacetime public health systems that would protect generations. Dr. Victor walked through expanding pharmaceutical plants in New Jersey, watching production lines that had manufactured wartime vaccines now producing medicines for civilian populations. The industrial capacity built to defeat biological warfare had created medical abundance that would define American healthcare for decades. Post-war medical infrastructure represented democracy's lasting victory over totalitarian biological threats. Pharmaceutical companies maintained production capabilities developed during wartime. Hospital networks expanded using organizational methods proven under military conditions. Medical research continued investigating biological warfare countermeasures, creating defenses against future threats. The systems built to stop Japanese bioweapons had evolved into comprehensive biological security. CDC laboratories studied Unit 731 research data obtained through post-war negotiations with Japanese scientists. The biological weapon knowledge that might have terrorized American cities instead strengthened American biological defenses. Enemy research became Allied intelligence, improving vaccines, treatments, and detection methods. Scientific knowledge flowed toward healing rather than harming. Reflecting democratic values translated into medical practice, manufacturing statistics revealed the transformation of military medical production into civilian healthcare abundance. Penicillin factories continued operating at wartime capacity, making antibiotics available for routine medical care. Vaccine production lines adapted to civilian diseases, protecting populations against biological threats, both military and natural. The industrial systems that had prepared for biological warfare now prevented ordinary epidemics. The blood bank networks established during wartime became permanent medical infrastructure, serving civilian populations. The voluntary donation systems that had supplied military medical needs now supported hospital networks across the country. Regional blood centers coordinated supplies using transportation and communication systems developed for wartime medical logistics. Medical cooperation had become medical prosperity. Medical training programs expanded using methods developed for wartime emergency preparation. Nurses learned biological warfare countermeasures alongside routine medical procedures. Doctors studied epidemic control using techniques developed for military biological defense. Medical education incorporated biological warfare knowledge into civilian medical practice, creating healthcare professionals prepared for any biological threat. The post-war medical infrastructure represented more than expanded healthcare capacity. It embodied democratic society's transformation of military necessity into civilian benefit. Industrial systems built for war had created peacetime prosperity. Scientific knowledge developed for biological defense had improved ordinary medical care. The preparations made to stop biological weapons had created medical systems that served free people better than any in human history. Victors surveyed pharmaceutical plants producing medicines for worldwide distribution. American medical exports would carry biological security to allied nations, extending democratic protection globally. The industrial capacity that had defeated biological warfare would now prevent biological threats anywhere in the free world. Medical abundance had become America's gift to allied nations seeking biological security. The war ended not with fleas raining down on San Diego or plague sweeping through Los Angeles, but with two blinding flashes over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the silence that followed, Japan's grand biological gamble, Operation Black Rain, was reduced to a footnote in the annals of military history. Yet the ghost of what might have been lingered, shaping science, ethics, and geopolitics long after the guns fell silent. The laboratories of Unit 731 were dismantled in haste. Technicians smashed glassware, burned documents, and buried cages of diseased fleas beneath the frozen soil of Manchuria. Prisoners, too valuable to leave as witnesses and too inconvenient to transport, were executed by the hundreds. Concrete walls still smelled of disinfectant and decay, a mixture that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. To the outside world, nothing seemed to remain but ruins. But in truth, fragments of data and fragments of guilt were carried westward, into American intelligence files and Soviet archives alike. In the years immediately after Japan's surrender, U.S. military intelligence faced a dilemma. The men who had designed Operation Black Rain were war criminals by every moral measure. They had dissected prisoners alive, infected children with plague, and weaponized death with clinical detachment. Yet their data, painstakingly recorded through atrocities, contained information about disease progression and human vulnerability that no ethical scientist could ever collect. General Douglas MacArthur made a decision both pragmatic and controversial. The United States would shield Shiro Ishii and his colleagues from prosecution in exchange for their research. To some, it was a betrayal of justice. To others, a grim necessity in the emerging Cold War. The Soviet Union had captured fragments of Unit 731's facilities and had its own scientists hungry for biological warfare programs. America could not afford to fall behind. Thus, the plague fleas that never crossed the Pacific still shaped the geopolitics of the nuclear age. Reports derived from Unit 731's experiments circulated at Fort Detrick, where American scientists studied them under the label of medical intelligence. Officially, they were lessons in defense, how to recognize plague symptoms, how to contain outbreaks, how to train doctors for biological emergencies. Unofficially, they represented the dark bargain democracies sometimes make in the name of security. For decades, the truth remained hidden. Trials at Tokyo largely ignored Japan's biological programs, focusing instead on conventional atrocities. Survivors of Unit 731's experiments, mostly Chinese, Korean, and Russian, lived with scars that the world refused to acknowledge. Their testimonies, when they surfaced, were often dismissed as propaganda or buried beneath official secrecy. But silence has a half-life. By the 1980s and 1990s, scholars began piecing together the truth from declassified documents and survivor accounts. Unit 731 emerged from the shadows as one of the 20th century's greatest crimes against humanity. Museums rose in Harbin, memorializing the dead. International conferences debated whether scientific data born of atrocity could ever be used ethically. Medical associations tightened codes of conduct, insisting that research without consent was not science, but murder. The plague fleas never reached San Diego, but their legacy reshaped medical ethics worldwide. Modern standards of informed consent, bioethics review boards, and human subject protections were strengthened in part because of what Ishii's laboratories had done in secret. The horrors of Unit 731 became a warning etched into the DNA of medical research. Knowledge cannot be bought at the price of humanity. The American side of the story, the side of abundance and medical preparation, left its own legacy. Fort Detrick, born as a counter to Axis biological threats, became the center of U.S. biological research during the Cold War, vaccine production. Facilities that had churned out millions of doses during the 1940s laid the groundwork for a post-war pharmaceutical boom. Blood banks, antibiotic factories, and plasma storage networks transitioned into peacetime institutions, feeding into hospitals and clinics across the nation. Mary Johnson, the San Diego nurse who had inspected plasma stores in 1945, lived to see penicillin prescribed for routine infections and vaccines distributed in public schools. For her, the greatest victory was that America's medical machine, built to resist bioweapons, had become the backbone of public health. The same abundance that had shielded the nation from plague now protected children from measles, polio, and tuberculosis. Boeing's factories, which once turned out B-29s by the hour, shifted to civilian aircraft after the war. American skies filled not with bombers but with commercial airliners, symbols of prosperity rather than destruction. Industrial power, once measured in tons of bombs, now measured in passengers carried and cities connected. The arsenal of democracy had become the infrastructure of peace, at least within American borders. In Tokyo, the story of the I-400 submarines ended quietly. Both vessels were surrendered to the U.S. Navy in 1945, inspected for their technological novelty, and then deliberately scuttled off the coast of Hawaii in 1946. Better to bury them in the sea than risk their secrets leaking to Soviet allies. Today, divers sometimes visit the rusting hulks, lying silent on the ocean floor. They are monuments not to battles fought, but to battles imagined and abandoned. Their watertight compartments, once meant for plague bombs, now serve as reefs for fish. The ocean erases ambition as surely as fire erases paper. Operation Black Rain lies there, too, forgotten by many, remembered by few, a nightmare sealed in salt water. What of the children who clutched gas masks in San Diego classrooms, preparing for a reign of plague that never came? They grew up in the post-war boom, trading blackout curtains for television screens and ration books for supermarkets. Many never learned how close they had been to becoming targets of biological war. Their city thrived as a hub of aerospace and naval power, a place where America's defensive abundance turned into peacetime prosperity. Yet the drills left traces. Sociologists later noted that the generation raised under wartime precautions displayed heightened civic awareness and resilience. They were accustomed to community mobilization, to the idea that survival required collective action. Those habits endured, shaping local politics, civil defense strategies, and eventually responses to natural disasters. The community that once prepared for plague prepared equally well for earthquakes and fires. Democracy's strength, after all, lay not only in factories, but in ordinary citizens willing to act together. History often tempts us with counterfactuals. What if Ishii had solved his logistical problems? What if the I-400 submarines had sailed with their plague-filled bombs? What if San Diego and Los Angeles had faced outbreaks in August 1945, just as atomic bombs fell on Japan? The answers, though speculative, reinforce the story's central truth. Even had the Fleas landed, American medical infrastructure stood ready to respond. Antibiotics, vaccines, and plasma reserves could have blunted the outbreak. Casualties might have numbered in the thousands, but not in the millions Ishii dreamed of. And retaliation, swift, overwhelming, nuclear, would have followed. Operation Black Rain could not have changed the outcome of the war. It could only have darkened its closing days with unnecessary suffering. The real question is not, what if the Fleas had been released? But what does it mean that men sought to release them at all? That is the question that haunts history. The reminder that scientific brilliance without moral restraint can lead to horrors worse than ignorance. Today, the ruins of Unit 731 in Harbin stand as a museum. Visitors walk through cold corridors where once plague-infected Fleas were bred, looking at rusted equipment and faded photographs. Guides tell stories of prisoners who never left alive. Children on school trips press their faces to glass cases, trying to imagine the unimaginable. In Washington, Fort Detrick still operates, though its mission has shifted to biomedical research, vaccine development, and public health defense. Laboratories that once prepared for plague outbreaks now study emerging diseases like Ebola and COVID-19. The legacy of abundance, mass production of medical supplies, rapid response networks, public health coordination, remains alive. The Pacific Ocean still rolls between Asia and America, indifferent to what might have crossed its waters in 1945. No submarine ever carried Ishii's Fleas across its expanse. The nightmare died in planning rooms, strangled by logistics and scarcity. Yet the memory survives, a cautionary tale of ambition, unchecked by morality, and of societies defined by the choices they make when threatened. In the end, Operation Black Rain never materialized, not because of mercy, but because of mathematics. Japan could not feed its people, much less its Fleas. Submarines could not carry both fuel and plague. Scientific knowledge could not overcome industrial scarcity. The plans collapsed beneath the weight of reality, but America's story, the story of preparation, abundance, and medical supremacy, proved decisive. It was not merely bombs or bullets that shielded the nation, but antibiotics and vaccines, plasma and penicillin, nurses and medics. The arsenal of democracy was not only a stockpile of weapons, it was a shield of healing. The epilogue of this shadow war is thus a paradox. The weapon that might have killed millions instead gave birth to medical systems that saved millions more. Unit 731's atrocities spurred ethical reforms. America's abundance became global medicine. The plague that never fell over San Diego instead pushed humanity toward a deeper understanding of both its capacity for horror and its capacity for healing. History remembers the mushroom clouds, but in the quieter corners of archives and hospitals, another memory persists, of a war that might have been fought with Fleas. and of the civilization that stood ready, not just with bombs, but with bandages. The question that haunts history is not whether Japan could have unleashed plague upon America, but whether humanity can remember that science divorced from ethics becomes atrocity, and that abundance dedicated to healing becomes the truest defense. The fleas never flew. The bombs did. Yet, in the shadow of both, humanity learned. If you enjoyed the story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.